back on Monday, when I taught lesson 4-5, gentlemen, when I taught lesson 4-5 on Monday, I introduced our first solving quadratic equations. And if you recall, our method from lesson 4-5 was solving by factoring, right?
Yes.
We would take a quadratic equation, we would factor it, and we would set each part equal to 0. That is probably our best method, our easiest method, definitely my most favorite method. However, what's the problem? Does factoring always work?
Nope.
In every situation? No, there are certain equations that don't factor. And so those are the type that we're going to be working on the rest of the chapter. Today we are officially at solving completing the square. So we're going to look at solving using square roots, which you've probably done a little bit of. Will seem familiar. And then we're also going to solve by completing the square. It's in Algebra 1, but I'm not sure it's in Algebra 1 standard, so I don't know if you guys did completing the square in Algebra 1 or not. Might be new. Might be old. But let's start with these example 1s. Okay? As we look at this first set, example A, like 4x squared plus 10 equals 36, or as you look at any of those in that row, what's different about these from the ones we did on Monday when we were factoring? What kind of form were the ones we were factoring usually in? If you look back on Monday. Standard form as in
X squared plus bx plus c.
Okay, meaning most of the time when we're doing a product and sum, there was an x squared, there was an x term, and there was a constant term. Notice what's missing here? The x term, right? We don't have a bx term. We have the ax squared and we have c, but we don't have bx. So, things change. Instead of making my equation equal to 0, I have a different job. And that job, when I just have an x squared term and then constants, is to get the x squared by itself. So, think with me here. How do I work to get x squared by itself? Okay, if it's 4x squared plus 10, you know what? I just looked at my notes. That 36 needs to change so this works out the way I want it to be. Pretend that 36 really says 46. So if anyone's figured this out and worked ahead, sorry, I just changed your life on that one. But okay, so still agree. In order to get the x squared term by itself, we need to subtract 10. If you subtract 10 on the left, you subtract 10 on the right. What does my equation become after I subtract 10? 4x squared equals 36. Now how do I get x squared by itself? Divide by 4. If we divide by 4, we now have x squared equals 9. Okay. What's the final trick to solving these?
Square root.
Square root. So you do know it. Okay, so in order to get from an x squared to an x, we take the square root. If you square root the left, you square root the right. So now, what is the square root of 9?
3.
And negative 3. Remember, when you take the square root in an equation setting, you always have to account for both answers, the positive and the negative solution. So, typical of quadratic equations, we've got 2 answers. When we were factoring, we usually had 2 answers. Here that I'm square rooting, I have 2 answers. I honestly don't remember what Math Excel wants. You could write your answer as 3, negative 3. You could also write your answer as plus or minus 3. I do know there's a plus or minus sign on Math Excel. I honestly can't remember what Math Excel wants at this exact moment. Does that make sense? So, I'm fine with either, though. You just have to figure out how to please Math Excel right now. questions on that problem? Okay. It's an easy type of problem. You just have to remember how to do it. That's the catch, I feel like. We forget how to solve this. Okay. B. 3x squared minus 5 equals 25. What was our first step on the last one? No. I have x squared term and I have number terms. Add 5 because what am I trying to do? Get the x squared by itself, right? So I'm going to even write up here. My first step is to isolate the x squared term. Okay, if you're a step person, that's the first step. Isolate x squared. So we add 5. I now have 3x squared equals 30. Now what? How do I continue to isolate x squared? Divide by 3. So I divide by 3, and I'm going to have x squared equals 10. Once you get the x squared isolated by itself, what is my next step? Square root. So step 2 is to square root. So what's the square root of x squared? X. What's the square root of 10? Okay. It's some irrational decimal if you grab the calculator, okay? I can tell you it's 3 point something because it's above 9. Okay. Here's what the square root of 10 is for our purposes. The square root of 10. And what's my other answer? Negative square root of 10. So what do you think I'm going to write? Plus or minus. I'm going to write my answer as plus or minus the square root of 10. Are you getting this process? This is the easy part, right? The key is knowing how to use it or when to use it. Okay, so that means you guys can tell me what to do. If it's 7x squared minus 10 equals 25. Step 1, add 10. We're trying to get x squared by itself. So 7x squared equals 35. Now I'm going to divide by 7. X squared equals 5. I heard it. Final step, once x squared is by itself, square root it. What's my solutions? Plus or minus square root of 5. Square root of 5 is a big, long, not fun decimal, so plus or minus square root of 5 is what we'll write. Don't forget the plus or minus. Okay, real quick, they don't take long, otherwise I'd skip this. 2x squared plus 9 equals 13. You guys got it? Step 1? Subtract 9 because you're getting that x squared by itself. 2x squared equals 4. Next step? Divide by 2 because I'm still trying to get x squared by itself. And so now x squared equals 2. Last step? Square root. What is the square root of 2? Square root of 2. What are my solutions then? Plus or minus square root of 2. Okay. When I suggest solve using square roots, this is the method I'm talking about. Isolate that x squared and then take the square root of both sides. We're okay with that, aren't we? Okay. That leads us into solving a perfect square trinomial. This is a modification of what we just did up above. Okay, so we're being asked to solve x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 25. First of all, notice I have an x term back in, don't I? Okay, so it's no longer just isolate x squared and square root. Now, what you don't necessarily realize, 25, as you guys look at 25, you're probably going to realize that one is a perfect square. X squared plus 4x plus 4 is actually what I would call a perfect square because it's a perfect square trinomial. Now, I don't necessarily expect you guys to recognize that, so here's what I'm going to tell you to do. I'm going to tell you to factor the left side. So, okay, side note, I'll go over and solve here in a moment. Review of our basic factoring skills, and I'm going to do this the easy way. X squared plus 4x plus 4. That's x squared plus bx plus c, so that factors into two parentheses, right? This is coming back to you. X squared breaks into x times x. What do I need in the way of numbers? Multiplying to be 4. Adding to be 4 is 2 and 2. What if they multiply to be a positive and add to be a positive? Everybody's positive. So I just wrote x plus 2, x plus 2. Yeah, how can I write that? I can write that as x plus 2 squared. When I taught factoring, guys, I taught perfect square trinomials. I don't know how much you remember it. Not everyone liked it. Okay. Notice my product in sum still works, doesn't it? So let's look. X squared plus 4x plus 4. Rewrite this as x plus 2 quantity squared equals 25. The idea here, guys, is I have perfect squares on both sides. What can I do to get rid of the perfect squares? Take the square root. So the idea here is because on that left side it's parentheses squared, we can take the square root. If I take the square root of the left, we're going to take the square root of the right. Now, what happens when you take the square root of x plus 2 squared? Yeah, I always like to think the square root and the squared are essentially canceling each other out. And so what remains? X plus 2. Because that power of 2 and that square root are inverses of each other. They cancel each other out. On the right, what's the square root of 25? And? Negative 5. So I'm actually going to write this as plus or minus 5. Anytime you take a square root in an equation setting, you have to include a plus or minus. And we generally include it on the side that suggests a number. Do you know how to solve from here? If it's x plus 2, how do we get x by itself? Subtract 2. Now, what am I subtracting 2 from?
Negative 5.
Okay, so realize how many answers am I going to have here? I'm going to have 2. You are quite okay if you just want to write it like that, like write your subtract 2, and then on the next line say x equals blank comma blank. I'm fine with that. If you are kind of confused when I say the whole 2 answer thing and you would rather separate the equations, you can choose to write x plus 2 equals 5 or x plus 2 equals negative 5. If that visual would help you a little bit more, then please do so. Okay? If that visual is overkill for you, then don't do it. So what kind of answers do I end up with? Positive 5 minus 2 is 3. Or negative 5 minus 2 is negative 7. Questions on that? The key on this one will be catching that you can factor. That will be the key. And again, this is all leading us up to completing the square. So, okay, let's try the second example in this section then. X squared minus 14x plus 49 equals 25. What am I going to ask you to do first? Factor the left side. And again, this is in the section of we're factoring perfect square trinomials. So if I factor the left, it's x squared minus 14x plus 49. X squared breaks into x and x. You guys tell me the numbers. Negative 7, negative 7. Multiplying to be 49, adding to be 14 is 7 and 7. Multiplies to be a positive and adds to be negative. They're both negatives. Which x minus 7 times x minus 7 can also be written as x minus 7 squared. Okay, so x minus 7 squared equals 25. So first step, factor that left side. After you factor the left, what am I set up to do? Take the square root of both sides. What's the square root of x minus 7 squared? X minus 7. What's the square root of 25? 5 and negative 5, or in other words, plus or minus 5. Excuse me. How do I finish? If it's x minus 7, we need to add 7. Okay? And that means you're adding 7 to 5 and negative 5. For the benefit of anyone looking at my notes, I'm writing out both equations. I get if you're sitting in here, you may say, nope, never mind, it's overkill. That's fine. I just don't want anyone to not be sure what to do. Okay, so if we add 7 to 5, we're going to get what? 12. And if we add 7 to negative 5, we're going to get 2. So solutions of 12 and 2. Okay. Got the idea here? So we solved first of all using square roots. So let's isolate the x squared, take the square root. We just solved using square roots again. This time we had to factor first and then take the square roots. This all leads us into solving by completing the square. And there's some steps here on completing the square. And we're going to look at these steps. Now, do notice I did make a change. There's a typo on your paper. Step 1 should say rewrite the equation in the form x squared plus bx equals c. Your notes say plus c, I believe. Okay, so go ahead and change that for me. Because if you don't change that, these notes are going to make 0 sense. Okay, I'll kind of talk a little bit about this steps, this one in the example, and then we'll go through example 3 below it following these steps, okay? So, curiosity though, do you guys remember the completing the square? I feel like we kind of quit doing it in Algebra 1 because they didn't require it. So, okay, we'll see what happens here. Okay, so, step 1 is rewrite the equation in the form x squared plus bx equals c. Normally we want an equation equal to 0 to solve when it's quadratic, right? But in this one, that's not how it works. We want it to be x squared plus bx equals c. As in, here's the example of 0 equals x squared minus 6x minus 10. I want x squared and x on one side, the minus 10 on the other side. So add 10, and you have x squared minus 6x equals 10. One other thing I need to point out here. Notice in front of x squared, there's nothing there, right? That means the only number that can be in front of x squared is 1. There can be no other number there. And so if there's a number there, you have to get rid of it, divide it away. Okay, step 2 is where we do what is called complete the square by adding b over 2 squared to each side of the equation. So as we look here, what's my b value? My b value is negative 6. And so what you'll be doing is negative 6 divided by 2, which is negative 3. And then negative 3, when you square that, is 9. This is this piece right here that's being added to both sides of the equation. In all honesty, if it was me doing it, I would just write it as 9, as opposed to the negative 6 over 2 squared. But that's that piece right there, that you add 9 to both sides, keeping the equation balanced, right? What you do to one side, you do to the other side. And again, we'll go over this more specifically. Step 3 is factor the left side. You know how the last set of problems we just did, we were factoring the left? Same idea. You're factoring the left into perfect square. X minus 3 squared. Clean up the right equals 19. Step 4, square root both sides. Just like what we did on the previous problems up above. Take the square root of both sides. Step 5, solve for x. So steps 3, 4, and 5 is what we just did on the previous steps. It's steps 1 and 2 that are the new parts. Okay? Now, I get that may be a blur, because I didn't actually work that example out. Let's work one out. So our example is 3x squared minus 12x plus 6 equals 0. So what is step 1? Okay. Minus a 6 because she's trying to get us in the form of x squared plus bx equals c. So I want my constants to move to the right. So we need to move that plus 6, and we're going to move that by subtracting 6. So I now have 3x squared minus 12x equals 0 minus 6 is negative 6. Have I fully completed step 1? What's the catch? Yeah, I specifically made the point of saying it's x squared plus bx equals c. It's 1x squared. You cannot leave a number in front of x squared. That's just how completing the square works. So what are we going to do to move that number?
Divide by 3.
Divide by 3. Now, if you divide that first term by 3, we're dividing everybody by 3. And we can do this because it's an equation. As long as you divide both sides, we're all good. So now I have x squared minus 4x equals negative 2. You'll notice I left a little bit of a gap there. I did that on purpose. Okay. Have we completed step 1 yet?
Yes.
Yeah, I have 1x squared plus bx equals c. So step 1 feels completed. Okay, step 2. says complete the square by adding b over 2 squared to each side of the equation. So first of all, what is my current b? My current b, -4. Do you guys all understand why I said current b? Okay. Thank you. You guys threw out the -12. That's exactly what I wanted to hear and didn't want to hear all at the same time. Make sure you get the current b. So b is -4. Okay, so it said b over 2 squared is what I need to find. So what's that mean I'm doing? -4 over 2 and squared. So, inside, what is -4 divided by 2? -2. -2 squared. So -2 times -2 is +4. There's -2 squared, and it is +4. Basic math there. I didn't do anything tricky. I always tend to say half of b and square it. So half of -4 is -2 and squared is 4. Now what did it say to do with that b over 2? We're going to add it to each side of the equation. You add to the left, you add to the right, which means, I told you I left a gap on purpose. I'm going to add 4 on the left there. I'm also going to add 4 on the right. Okay. That is step 2. We found b over 2 squared, and we added it to both sides. Questions at that point? Okay. Step 3 says to factor the left side into x plus b over 2 squared. Step 3 is like the very first step I took in my previous problems. Factor the left side. Here's a hint though. Factoring your left side will always factor into 2 identical parentheses. That's the whole idea of completing the square. So, think about it. X squared is going to break into what? X and X, right? Pick the bad marker. What multiplies to be 4 and adds to be -4? What multiplies to be 4 and adds to be 4? 2 and 2. How do my signs have to work? Negatives, right? Because a negative times a negative is a positive. A negative plus a negative adds to be a negative. So how can x squared minus 4x plus 4 be rewritten? X minus 2 squared. If you would prefer to write it out as x minus 2 times x minus 2, you can. But it's the same thing as saying x minus 2 quantity squared. Clean up the right. What is -2 plus 4? That's 2. Something else I can point out, a connection. See this -2 that just ended up in here? This is the same -2 as what's right here, what you squared to get 4. And it will always be true of that. Okay? Okay, what's the next step? We factored the left, now what? Step 4 says square root both sides, which is just like what you were doing up above, right? We square root both sides. What is the square root of x minus 2 squared? The square root and the square cancel each other out. X minus 2. What is the square root of 2? Square root of 2. What do you have to throw in front of it? Plus or minus. Whoops. Square root of 2. And then step 5 is solve for x. If it says x minus 2, we're going to add 2. Now, when we add 2, can you add 2, a whole number 2, to a radical? No. It just stays as the two things being added. You can't actually physically add them. The best thing to do here, because we have that plus and minus in front of the radical, the way I prefer to write it is put the 2 out front and say 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. You could say plus or minus the square root of 2 and then put a plus 2 at the end. In my opinion, it's kind of awkward though. When I see a plus minus sign, it seems more natural to me to have it in the middle. Okay? So you've just completed your first completing the square problem. That doesn't seem familiar from Algebra 1? Okay, and that's fine. As I said, I think we kind of took it out of the Algebra 1. It's in the Algebra 1 material, but I think we kind of quit teaching it because it's not in the standards there. So, let's see. Where are we at? Let's see if we can run through one more. And then that will leave us one to practice on tomorrow. Okay, so I'm going to write it up here. What form are we starting with? X squared plus bx equals c, and what number has to be in front of x squared? A 1. Okay. I know my steps aren't here, but I'm going to run you through the same steps. You're welcome to flip back and forth. Step 1, get it in that form. X squared plus bx equals c. What kind of things need to happen here? Okay. I need my x's and x squareds on the left. So I'm going to take this positive x and subtract x over. I need my constants on the right. So what am I moving over? Since it's plus 3, I'm going to subtract 3. So let's see what I have here. 2x squared. What's minus x minus x? Negative 2x. So it's minus 1 minus 1. So minus 2x. 3 minus 3 cancels. Equals x minus x cancels, and 9 minus 3 is 6. Have I completed step 1? I have to have 1x squared. So we're going to divide by 2. Dividing by 2, I now have x squared minus x equals 3. Okay. Step 1, are we good yet? Okay. Step 2 is the actual completing the square step. This is where it says half of b and squared, or add b over 2 squared to both sides. So first of all, what is my current b? You like how I'm asking that? Bless you. Okay, so current b is negative 1. What do I do with that b? Divide it by 2 and square it. So that means I'm doing negative 1 divided by 2 and squaring it. What is negative 1 divided by 2? Negative 1/2. And I'm going to leave it as a fraction. I prefer fractions over decimals in this situation. What's negative 1/2 times negative 1/2? Positive 1/4. 1 times 1 over 2 times 2. What do I do with that 1/4? Add it to both sides. So I'm going to add 1/4 after the x, and I'm going to add 1/4 after the 3. Okay. Step 2, or step 3, is factor it. My factoring will always look like this. X squared breaks into x and x, right? Or what's the square root of x squared? X. What's the square root of 1/4? The square root of 1/4 is 1/2. Or how did I get 1/4, guys? I squared negative 1/2. So this is going to be minus 1/2. You always know the sign. It always matches with the middle term. Since this says minus x, it's minus 1/2. 3 plus 1/4 is 3 1/4. I'm going to go improper, guys. Can you make this improper? 4 times 3 is 12, plus 1 is 13/4. 13/4. Okay, I factored the left. Step 4 is to take the square root. On the left, what's the square root of those parentheses squared? The parentheses. X minus half. On the right, what's the square root of 13/4? Okay. What's the square root of 13? Square root of 13. What's the square root of 4? 2. So how I'm going to write this is square root of 13 over a regular 2. Because you can take the square root of the top and not the bottom, or vice versa. And what did I forget to put in here? Plus or minus. Last step. How do I get x by itself? If it's x minus 1/2, we're going to add 1/2. I'm going to write this again with my plus minus in the middle, which means I'm going to write what? 1/2 plus or minus square root of 13 over 2. Okay, tomorrow we'll pick up here in the notes, and I might be able to get you guys a little work time as well, working with our completing the square. Have a good day, guys. If 4 or 5 is not done, make sure it gets done. And you're welcome to start on 4, 6.